Okay, creating miracles in your life with the power of thought. I'm Harv Bishop from harvbishop.com, where we're all about re-envisioning spirituality, what works, what doesn't, what needs to change. Tonight's guest is Mitch Horowitz. Mitch has written a fantastic new book, The Miracle Club, How Thoughts Become Reality. Let's hit that again, How Thoughts Become Reality. That's a serious opportunity to make some life changes. And I've got to say, this is absolutely, hands down, absolutely one of my favorite books in terms of new thought and using thought to change your life. And it's different. It's very different than anything I think that I've ever read before. So super excited for the interview. Welcome, Mitch.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I thought
across the Atlantic. You're in Vienna right now. Is that right?
Yeah, we're Vienna to New York.
Right.
So, I thought maybe a good place to start would be with something fairly simple, which is, how do you define a miracle?
I define a miracle as anything that is a radical, fortuitous departure from all expected circumstance. So I think we can speak of miracles today insofar as people experience things that are dramatic and epically needed breaks with anything that you might have been able to predict or derive from surrounding circumstance. So in that sense, I feel we can use the term miracle in a very direct and plain way.
And what kind of feedback have you been getting so far from readers and people participating in the Miracle Club?
Well, it's been very gratifying because the book's only been out for a few days, of course, as we're speaking. But the feedback that I'm getting is people feel that there is a New Thought book available to them that's mature in language and tone, that acknowledges the presence of suffering, that calls for New Thought to develop a theology of suffering, that offers a theory of mind causation, of why our thoughts seem to select and create things that happen to us. And I think, at least insofar as what I'm hearing in these opening days of publication, people feel that the book is a companion, that it gives them an opportunity to re-enter New Thought on serious, mature terms.
Yeah, that's definitely something we've noticed as well. You know, just like you can go back to the classics, but with a new, more sophisticated understanding.
That's my wish. Yeah.
And how does the Miracle Club approach differ from traditional New Thought teachings?
Well, I think it differs in that I acknowledge the existence of many laws and forces under which we live. And I think that that's a vital place for New Thought to rediscover itself in the 21st century. I think that it may very well be true, as my hero Neville Goddard teaches, that the mind is the ultimate arbiter of reality. But under the circumstances in which we live, we also are necessarily in the pathways of multiple laws and forces, including physical decline, including mortality. These are inescapable facts of life to which there's never been any exception. And I tell people that a law, in order to be a law, must be consistent. But at the same time, there are things that we regard as natural laws, like gravity, that vary tremendously based on your vantage point. You're going to experience gravity very differently on the planet Earth than you will on Jupiter. In space, you're not going to experience any gravity at all. You'll experience a vacuum simply because there's no mass, and gravity is affected by mass. Gravity is still there. It's still a natural law. It's still ever operative, but it differs based on circumstance. And I think the law of the mind is exactly the same way. So when we speak of a natural disaster or something, or when we speak of a tragedy occurring, even in circumstances that seem hopeful and supportive and loving, I would say it's not that the law of mind has somehow ceased or not working, or that, we've been wrong about all this, but rather that there are other circumstances intervening that we have to take into account. That's the deal that we live with within this cosmic framework. And I also, I love and I try to retain all the idealism of the New Thought movement. I believe in it, I love it, I practice it, I live by it, I encourage it. But we have to be able to meet people where they live, whether they're dealing with end-of-life issues, whether they're dealing with some protracted disappointment, whatever they're facing, we have to have an answer for them that goes beyond, well, if you're not getting precisely the results you want, you're just doing it wrong. That doesn't hold up anymore in the 21st century because life is too complex. At the same time, I love the sense of possibility, the hope, the epic practicality of New Thought. And I bring all that to the book as well.
And I think one of the things I'm impressed with is it seems like if you acknowledge that New Thought has some of these situations, some of these issues, what would a New Thought practice look like? And
Yes.
Here is another area where I think you really break new ground. I mean, traditional political New Thought begins and ends with affirmative prayer, with manifestation practice, with positive thinking. And I know in my own experience, I felt a tremendous burden to constantly be thinking positive, to be thinking positive thoughts. But you offer an array of practices that meets the individual where they are, if they're having a down day, if they're having an up day.
Yes. I think it's important. I use the term positive thinking all the time. I describe New Thought as the positive mind movement, or I speak of positive mind metaphysics. I don't want to distance myself from any of that language because I think it's very important to be understood, and that language has entered the popular culture, and I think it should be embraced. At the same time, I think of New Thought more as a deliberative thinking. The idea is not always to walk around looking on the bright side of the street so much as it's to have a definite goal and aim and to realize that your mind is a tool, is a contributor to what concretely happens to you. And so, for example, that could mean using affirmations and visualizations in a very concentrated way just before you drift off to sleep at night, which is a state of mind that I write about in the book called the hypnagogic state. Very supple, very powerful state of mind. There are heightened occurrences of psychical phenomena during that period of time, and this is something that's been very carefully clinically studied and validated. That is a time in which it's much easier to impress your subconscious with a certain idea. And sleep researchers themselves are asking deepened questions about this hypnagogic state. We don't fully understand it yet. It's kind of this borderland, this dream world where you experience things that are hallucinatory and yet you also have directed control over your own attention. So it's a time of day unlike any other. And I go into this detail because it's a way of saying that it's not just about looking on the sunny side of the street. Certainly looking on the sunny side of the street has its place, and I'm first in line to shake anyone's hand who's doing that, and I attempt it myself. However, there's all kinds of steps and practices and exercises that involve employing the energies of the mind, employing the mechanics and the metaphysics of the mind that go far beyond the same old positive thinking prescription, although I honor that prescription, and that is part of it.
Well, and one of the things that struck me as well is you talk about kind of surfing with your emotions. It's not so much that you want to suppress stuff, anger, frustration, those various things, but that there's different techniques, different things to do at different times. And one of the things that you advocate is, doing a positive mind visualization when you're in a peak state, when you're in the upflow. And there's other practices for those times when you're maybe not there.
Yes. I think that the emotions and the intellect run on two different tracks. And as a great teacher once put it, the mind is like steam power and the emotions are like nuclear power. And if you pit one against the other, the emotions are going to win every time. Now, in New Thought, we don't always feel comfortable with that distinction because many writers, Joseph Murphy among others, will say that everything begins with a thought. Everything begins with a thought. I'm not entirely sure that that's true, in the sense that we have a physical life, we have an intellectual life, we have an emotional life. All these things are going on. And thought plays a vital, seminal role in all of that. But I think there are these different forces even within us, as there are in the surrounding framework, that affect us and influence us. And I don't think you can pit thought against emotion exactly. And I think you have to use, as you were just alluding, positive meditations when you're in a state that supports that. There needs to be a unifying of the psyche in a certain sense. And I would define the psyche as a kind of convergence point where thought and emotion come together. Watch for those moments in your existence. Watch for those moments in your day-to-day life and use them, and use them. There are other times where that may not be available to you and you have to do something else. There are other times where doing something else may be impossible even, and it's not necessary. Maybe you need to take a break and you need to watch an episode of Star Trek or have a beer or do whatever it is you do to recharge and then come back. One can't always face the burden of having to be on, and having to be producing and having to be productive from a mental perspective. That's asking too much of the individual.
And among the practices you recommend, again, which is not that common to mainstream New Thought, is a more traditional form of prayer.
Yes. I describe prayer as a kind of escape hatch in a certain sense. There are times where we're too crushed by the circumstances of life to use our minds according to some of the prescribed ways. And yet at the same time, I don't think Mother Nature is playing a trick on us and painting us into a corner. At those times, that's when prayer is very necessary. And we're often taught in New Thought that prayer needs to be said in a spirit of calm, hopeful expectancy, that you need to pray believing that you already have received and so you shall. And of course that has scriptural basis. But my contention is there's no right or wrong way to pray. There are lots of records, also in scripture, of the patriarchs and the matriarchs arguing with God, getting angry at God, imploring God. And in fact, sometimes in these chapters, God will be persuaded to change his mind about something. Cain tells God that the punishment he's been given is too great, it's too burdensome. And God says, okay, well, I'll ameliorate it this way. I'll put a mark on you that will warn off anybody who might try to do you physical harm. And, there are numerous chapters in Scripture of Job arguing with God, of Jonah arguing with God, of Sarah laughing when she's told she's pregnant, and, people kind of interacting with God almost as a kind of family member or a cosmic colleague of some sort or another. And so what I'm really trying to say is you don't need to follow any one prescription for prayer. You can beg, you can throw yourself on your knees, you can pray with calm expectancy, you can go into a quiet place and pray with a feeling of great confidence. Some people say that when you conclude your prayer and you feel confident, that's assuredness that it will be answered. I would say that may very well be true, but you can also conclude your prayer with a sense of doubt and uncertainty, and I think there's also something there for you. There's no right or wrong way to do this, but we do have prayer as a kind of escape hatch from the difficulties of our environment and our own psyches.
And could you touch also a little bit on chanting? That's one of the things that I found interesting.
Yes, in the book, I write specifically about a friend of mine, Emily Grossman, who was suffering from and is in a state of recovery from bipolar disorder. And she's an absolutely remarkable person, possessed of a great intellect, who faced a truly crushing mental disease and a road to recovery that was fraught with difficulties. And one of the ways she dealt with this was by making a daily practice of the Buddhist chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, which is basically a Japanese version of the Sanskrit that makes up the first line of the Lotus Sutra. And Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, loosely translated, means I aligned myself with the cosmic law of cause and effect. Now, Emily didn't discontinue her pharmacological treatment, which was absolutely vital. Absolutely vital. She didn't discontinue therapy or traditional medicine, but she augmented it with the chanting of Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, which brought her tremendous strength and energy. And she came to feel that there really is a metaphysical component along with traditional medicine to her recovery, and that she was able to bring herself into a kind of harmonious alignment with a cosmic law of cause and effect. There was a positive mind component to her therapy, and it was there for her at all times, in moods of darkness, in moods of difficulty, in moods of doubt. She found herself able to recite that chant very much along the lines of what I'm describing with respect to a prayer. And so I would say that's another of life's escape hatches. And I view that as part of the positive mind tradition, even though it isn't associated with New Thought per se. Anything that sees the mind as a kind of channel that can be suffused with cosmic laws or higher forces, anything that sees the mind as a tool of higher awareness or as a portal for some kind of divine influx, I think whether it's specifically part of New Thought tradition or not, is part of the positive mind tradition.
That speaks well to, I think, what you do throughout the book, and not only in terms of spiritual practices, but other things as well. You're breaking down lines, you're breaking down distinctions, and you're breaking down boundaries.
That's what I'm trying to do. These practices don't need to be associated with one figure, one doctrine, one outlook. Sometimes people get angry at me because they feel I've violated some rule of dogma or doctrine, or they feel that if I'm expressing doubts about a certain method or figure, even as I might in the very next line express my veneration for that person, when you're trying to bring critical sympathy to practices, that sometimes that rubs certain people the wrong way, and they feel that you're undercutting something that they have come to stand on. And that's the plague of all religions. That's the plague of all philosophies. That's the plague of all politics. This idea, that's where identification becomes kind of a treacherous thing and closes down our capacity to experiment and to exchange with one another, because we feel like, if I'm wearing a blue sweater and somebody tells me they don't like blue sweaters, or blue is their, not the color for them, it feels like a personal attack. And then, I attack back, and this becomes the whole story of human nature. We have to be willing to be porous. We have to do more than just recite things like, science of mind is open at the top, as Ernest Holmes once said. I mean, Ernest meant that. So if one is going to say that, don't dare say it without meaning it, or we're turning ourselves into just one more doctrine, one more religion with walls built around it, and we define ourselves by who we exclude. We have to, and New Thought is strong enough now. New Thought is strong enough, 150 years into its existence, to sustain all kinds of different approaches and suggestions and ideas. And I think the book is in some ways a celebration of that.
Another of the things that you talk about in terms of breaking down boundaries is so much of New Age thought, so much of alternative spirituality has been built around this notion that there is a higher self, and then there's the small ego. And you write that a lot of spiritual paths make people feel bad for having worldly ambitions.
Right. And we all do. I mean, it's funny because one of the things I love about New Thought is that it's always been a very practical spirituality. It's always been a spirituality that has represented the possibility of practical change, of attainment, of material well-being, of recovery. And sometimes that seems a difficult fit with the spiritual search, to some people at least. But I reject these definitions that somehow divide the world into two. The idea that There's inner and there's outer. There's attachment and non-attachment, identification, non-identification, essence and personality. You know, the greatest, and I think the most definitive word on this was enunciated by Christ, who simply said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and God what is God's." We live in a world that is suffused with transcendental needs, that is suffused with what might be called material needs. And I don't think any of them, at the end of the day, ultimately differ. I think they converge rather than diverge. And the point of existence, as best as I can come to at this stage of my own search, is to be generative, to be productive. I mean, we are here and told that we're made in the image of the Creator. And if that is correct, then it stands to reason that humanity is intended to produce, to create, to generate. Certainly, we're surrounded with a very vivid, tactile, material world in which we are absolutely required to function. Whatever our outlook on that world may be, we must draw breath. We must consume food. We will leave these physical forms at a certain point. There's no exception to that. So call the outer world samsara or illusion or whatever you want, but the fact is we are inextricably bound to it, inextricably bound to it. You must be clothed. You must have protection from the elements and so forth. So I don't think that humanity's existence can be divided into the cosmic and the material, or that an individual can be told, well, you know, you're being too outwardly focused, for example. It doesn't matter to me one way or the other whether I or my neighbor is outwardly focused. I do think there are a set of ethics that the religions universally inform us of that must accompany one's focus, primarily in nonviolence, by which I mean not usurping anyone else's right to pursue their own sense of self-development or pursue their own conception of their highest potential. So we are given guardrails by the religions, and I think universally so. But it's very clear to me that humanity is intended to operate as we must within this material framework. So I'm done, personally speaking, with divisions between identification, non-identification, attachment, non-attachment. It's all one thing, I believe. And I think New Thought meets us there. And that's one of the things I've always appreciated about the philosophy.
Yeah, they definitely have had overall a pretty balanced perspective between worldly attainment and some sort of inner development. And you also, that leads to what you talk about in terms of cautioning Western seekers from embracing wholeheartedly concepts like non-attachment from Buddhism or Dharma.
Yeah, I think those concepts are very, very difficult for the Western seeker. And I speak in terms of the Western seeker only because that's my vantage point. I don't think anybody can be truly happy unless he or she is moving progressively in the direction of some kind of personal attainment or accomplishment. And I think we can very dangerously twist ourselves into knots by simultaneously living in the world, but also telling ourselves it's all illusion. None of it's really here. I don't know that's true at all. In fact, to be perfectly frank with you, I can't fully verify that there's another world. I believe that there is. I've vested my whole life and all my interests in that conviction and that faith. But what happens after we die, I haven't the slightest idea. I can't verify that. I can quote chapter and verse from what other people have said, sometimes convincingly, sometimes less convincingly. But I'd be very careful of attaching yourself to anything that you cannot verify. And it seems to me that the material world is certainly verifiable. Again, call it illusion all you like, but you can only hold your breath for, such and such a number of seconds before the material world makes a demand on you, which is that you must take a breath. So I'd be very careful about using terms like illusion. I think that we are beings with a very broad spectrum of existence, and my presumption is that that existence includes an invisible and unseen dimension. But I do not absolutely know that. And I have no way of verifying that from my vantage point other than quoting other people. I could cite my own experiences, people could cite their own experiences, and there's good reason for that belief. In fact, I would say it's actually, maybe I'm being too absolute in the way I'm framing this. I mean, ESP research alone tells us that there's an extra physical aspect to existence. So we have evidence for that. We have evidence for that. But we're like on our knees peeking through a keyhole, picking up pictures and glimpses of what that other world is. We know that there is a way of transferring information that exceeds the five senses. We know that because since the early 1930s in this country alone, we've had rigorous, clinically structured experiments into ESP that demonstrate precognition, that demonstrate telepathy, that demonstrate the capacity to get an above average score when you're guessing what suit is going to be overturned on a deck of cards. So, and that's just scratching the surface. And there's quantum theory, there's neuroplasticity, there's the placebo response, there's all kinds of evidence that there exists a non-physical world. So I feel comfortable in saying that that's a fact. That's a fact. Mm-hmm. But I know very little about it. We know very little about it. Our generation is deeply tantalized, but it's almost like we stand in front of a deepened mystery than we do in front of a catalog of established ideas as to what this invisible world is. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that any seeker who believes that there's an invisible world has truth at his or her back, has truth at his or her back. But hand in hand with that, we also experience, as we draw every breath, the existence and the experiential reality of a material world. So it seems to me that we are called upon to function within this material world. There are many things that may be illusory about it. We may see reality in a truncated way, and I think we do. We may experience time in a way that's illusory. Linearity is probably a very powerful organizing mechanism for getting through life. There's an infinitude to our world which we're not privileged to see minute by minute. At the same time, we do have to function within this experiential framework, and it is a material framework in addition to being a transcendental one. So let's not create divisions, and let's be frank with ourselves that some conception of human happiness must include a form of aspiration and making one's way in this world as it is.
Another of the boundaries that you break down, and speaking of ASP, I mean, outside of Joseph Murphy and a few people and yourself now, I'm not aware of a great number of New Thought people who have turned to the ESP research to talk about how manifestation works. And I remember Ernest Holmes in the 1927 issue of Science, not issue, but the textbook, Science of Mind, he dealt with psychic phenomena. When that second edition came out, it was gone.
Oh, that's very interesting. That's very interesting, yeah.
So it's as if he felt he wouldn't be taken seriously. So,
well, you know, Freud made the same decision. Freud was a member of the British Society of Psychical Research, and he was convinced, and is on record writing about this in letters and other places, that telepathy could be of assistance in the analytic process. Telepathy was certainly reality, especially in the dream state. He was very interested in the experience of ESP, or psychical awareness, in the dream state. But there was a movement towards this material, and there was a movement away from it by people who felt that it would invalidate or bring some sort of a supernaturalism to their work, and that they were better off without it. You know, this was part of the reason for the split between Jung and Freud. I think it's very important, and I've written about this in Science of Mind magazine. I read about this a good deal in the book. I think it's important that we in New Thought know about developments in psychical research, because not only is it confirming of our spiritual instincts and practice, but it can give us concrete ideas. It can give us concrete ideas. Many, many years ago, the great psychical researcher J.B. Ryan at Duke University made the observation, which he just relegated to a footnote, but it's such an epic observation, that a feeling of positive expectancy seem to be the vital factor in whether someone got results from ESP trials, and that if the subject was depressed or fatigued or bored or skeptical of the possibility of results, then the results themselves would spike. But if the subject's spirits could be revived, if he or she was in an atmosphere of supportive collegiality, even just having a cup of coffee and kind of taking a break and then coming back into the lab, in itself could spike the results. So JB, I think, demonstrated and pointed out that hopeful expectancy was the open sesame as to whether there were going to be any results at all. The same is true, that seems to be the psychological mechanism through which the placebo response works. What the placebo response actually is a very mysterious and broad and open question. It may be many things going on at once. We rush to conclude sometimes that once we've identified a factor, it's the only thing happening. You know, one of the things I theorize in the book is that certain things happening in the body, like the autoimmune response kicking up or endorphins being released, that may be what prayer looks like in the body. That may be what the sense of affirmation or confidence or hopeful expectancy looks like in the body. You know, there may be a complex of things happening all at once, not just one thing happening. We still don't really know, once you extrapolate from hopeful expectancy, which is really just a description. It's really just somebody testifying to being in an emotive state that we all kind of agree consensually it means this. How that serves as a trigger, we really don't know. We really don't know. But the correlation is there. So, you know, this is something that psychical research has validated. Extra-physical phenomena seems to depend on hopeful expectancy. And that's a very important clue for us in terms of triggering desired states, things within ourselves, within patients, within loved ones.
One of the other pieces I think related to that is you could almost make the argument that instead of an overarching law of attraction, you do have something that, as you just said, can manifest in a lot of different ways. I mean, the mind-body response in some sense, body chemistry, as you say, there may be as yet unknown levels to the placebo response. And then at the same time, in later chapters, you talk about how ESP can fuel, or is the highway that synchronicities run on. So
Yes.
the happy coincidences, so we may ultimately be looking at some very different but very much related phenomena.
Yes, it's very interesting. And I think it may be that what's going on, and this is taking a huge leap, but it's something that I developed in the book. It may be that what's going on is that there's an infinitude of things coexistent within our lives, in the same way that there's an infinitude of things happening in the particle lab, but a particle collapses from a wave state to a localized state only when someone takes a measurement. It could be that we're not manifesting so much as we're selecting, and that our senses and our mental pictures, our perspective, our emotionalized states, and so on, are kind of measuring devices that locate and isolate things, almost like we're placing a matrix grid on top of an infinitude of possibilities. And once that grid is drawn and you pinpoint a coordinate on it, you experience that as reality. It's possible that, and this is something that quantum theorists have worked with for many decades, it's possible that that selection of experience, that measurement, not only specifies what you go through now, but creates a past, present, future, or selects a past, present, future, so that whatever you're experiencing seems to flow naturally out of events which you and I and the people listening may be creating, maybe selecting, maybe co-selecting right now. And it feels to us every bit as real as the sound of my voice, and yet the very act of perspective brings in train with it, in its wake, a selected past as well, so that we're constantly undergoing these morphing, changing states, wave states, superposition, collapsing into actual experience. Because if these things are happening in the particle lab and they're lawful, by nature, a law has to be consistent. And people ask, well, gee, then how come I don't sense any of that? There's one table, there's one sofa, there's one of me here, there's one of you here. Why don't I sense any of that? William James theorized back in 1902, and quantum theorists have only recently caught up to him, that to the mystic, as James put it, life may be visible as if you're observing it through a microscope. You're looking at it with a very sharp instrumentation and you're seeing what's really going on. Whereas when you pan back and you're either not having mystical experience, or as quantum theorists would put it, you're not measuring with this exquisitely fine instrumentation anymore, you're gathering less and less information. So there's a so-called information leakage that occurs, and that our five senses that we experience as reality, as the organs that we negotiate through life with, are coarse, and we don't actually see all of what's going on. And we experience limitation and we experience linearity because that's what we can cope with in terms of the sensory equipment we have been given. But there are certain moments where we surpass that and we get a greater perspective. And there are certain moments where experience corresponds so closely and with such overwhelming exactitude and emotional relevance with our mental state that we think, wow, we call it a synchronicity because we don't know what else to call it, I mean, Jung, who I love, never really defined what a synchronicity was. Jung, brilliant, wonderful, genius though he was, would sometimes slap a name on something and feel that as long as it had been categorized as if on a chemical table of elements, we had our arms around it. But to say a synchronicity, is an acausal connection between events, it's a description. It's not a theory. It's not a mechanical model. So we call it a synchronicity or a coincidence. If you're a materialist, you would say, oh, there goes Horowitz again. He's just talking about confirmation bias. They love the term confirmation bias, as if people are just seeing things because they expect to see them. But confirmation bias, too, is a very limited concept. What is that? Does it cover all the bases? How do we know that it always is right? The things that you can measure on an actuarial table, maybe you could break them down into statistical likelihood, but what you can't break down with stats is the emotional impact and meaning that an event has to certain people. It's much harder to quantify that. So, all these terms, if you're a Jungian, if you're a materialist, if you're a statistician, we feel that as soon as we slap a vocabulary term on something, the mystery has left the room and we get it, we understand. New Age folk will use the term enlightenment in a way that I think is grossly sloppy. It's a term that never crosses my lips unless I'm using it to describe a conversation because I don't know what it means. And I don't care about enlightenment if it's not here with me next Thursday at 1:30 in the afternoon when I'm getting angry at a taxi cab driver or something. I care about what's operative, what's going on in the ordinary hours of life. And it seems to me that we experience the ordinary hours in a way that may be inaccurate, because in all these different areas, psychical research, quantum theory, the placebo response, theorizing into retrocausality, interdimensionality, and so on, we have hints that life is not the orderly thing that we've been brought up to believe it is. And we glean psychological and spiritual hints of that as well through our own experience and testimony. And we have generations of testimony, many generations, in which people talk about the uncanny congruity between a thought and an emotional state and an event. And we have evidence of such things in the psychical lab and so on. So we know enough to say that materialism and a belief in the world exactly as it seems to us in our five sensory state just doesn't cover all the bases, So it may be very simply that what's going on with positive mind mechanics is that we are selecting, and this is ever operative. And if we can direct that act of selection, we heighten our ability to impact our experience in a very concrete way. That's my theory of why it works.
And then it's actually, I love the idea of the matrix and the imagery with that, because it's inherently it's just difficult to wrap one's logically oriented cause and effect mind around.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now, what is honoring, in terms of honoring paradox, another of the themes along with breaking boundaries that you have in the book, why is that important to the spiritual path? And I think you've partly addressed it with your response previously.
It's interesting. You're the first one who's asked me about that in connection with this book. Someone said to me years ago that the measure of a person's spiritual development is his or her capacity to live with paradox. Apropos of what I was saying about synchronicity, we want to kind of break things down with vocabulary words and say, this is, precisely what's going on, and this is the formula. You add salt, you add water, you add flour, and you get bread. And the spiritual path doesn't work that way. Things are not always repeatable necessarily. I think our forebears in the late 19th century had the ideal that if you bring certain ingredients to the table, you'll get the same outcome every single time. And one of the things that we have had to face in the late 20th, early 21st century is that things are not always readily repeatable. In fact, many times things are not repeatable, which doesn't mean that they're not real, which doesn't mean that they didn't happen, which doesn't mean that they didn't occur, and that they didn't occur with the symmetry that the seeker testifies to. But they're not always repeatable, and that's very, very mysterious. And that can be very frustrating, because people will have an experience saying a certain prayer and maybe experience a healing, for example, and then they're facing another health threat, and they go through what they feel are the same steps, and they don't experience a healing or recovery. And that's very perplexing, and that's very confounding. And that leads the individual to ask, gosh, was this real in the first place? Was I just experiencing something as an illusion? Maybe their faith is challenged. The skeptics roll their eyes and say, well, of course, it was all just coincidence, whatever that is. And my contention is that we just live in such a suffusion of complexity that we're not always able to wrap ourselves around what is and isn't reality. Our instrumentation is just too coarse. We can glean experiences, we can glean testimony, and these things are real. These things are real. But coexistent forces will sometimes wreak havoc on our ability to arrive at neat theories. And that's just one aspect in which the seeker has to be willing to live with paradoxes. Uncertainty it's a vital part of the path. One must accept it.
And one of the examples of paradox that I was very struck by in the book, and it is, on the one hand, you talk about the need for clarity. You talk about Dean Radin and his synchronicity around finding a skilled researcher for a position he needed.
Yes.
On the other, we have Michael Nesmith from the Monkees, who talks about life never moves in a straight line.
Yes.
I'm wondering how you see the interplay between the chief definite aim, the need for clarity, and the fact that life tends to meander and not go in straight lines.
Yes, that's very interesting. And that strikes to the heart of why it's so necessary to accept paradox. I do think that life responds to perspective. I feel strongly about that. I also feel that one cannot possibly choose the means and the methods and the messenger by which that response arrives. There may be all kinds of ways, including very, very, very unexpected ones, sometimes very harmonious ones, sometimes very jarring ones, by which life answers our call, so to speak. There's a congruency, it seems to me, but that congruency exists within a swirl of cosmic chaos in which surprises, tricks, synchronicities, acausalities, all kinds of things that we apply words to are going on at once. And this is the meaning of living with paradox. People people set out an aim and they can find that that aim comes to them in a way that is remarkably congruent with what they were thinking, and yet is also remarkably surprising and outside of anything that they could have pinpointed. And sometimes it doesn't come at all. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. But the idea of life being infinite and resisting straight lines is that the symmetry, if there is any symmetry, arises from what the person experiences. And the experience, in many cases, is self-selected, or self-selected in part and in some dramatic ways. And the matrix grid is our own mind, in a certain sense. And I think that's why New Thought has proven so enduring in its popularity and its pull on the minds of people.
I'm curious too, if I was to hazard a guess, I would say that New Thought itself, again, there's exceptions, but is not terribly comfortable with the idea of paradox and spirituality.
Right, right. You know, part of New Thought's founding is vested in the idea that if you follow certain steps, a demonstration will result. And that's why the term science was in vogue early in the history of New Thought. Of course, we have the movement of Christian Science, which is a cousin to New Thought. I'm not sure my friends from Christian Science would agree with that, but that's my perspective. We have divine science, science of mind, Christian Science, other stems of the transcendental mind movement use the term science, and it was used with a great idealism. You know, these founders felt that they were part of the march of progress, and that if you laid down certain steps for treatment, an inevitable result would occur and would occur always. But results would occur, they just wouldn't be consistent. And I think New Thought is still imbued with this idea, even in its more liberal reaches, that one mental super law or one law of attraction controls everything, and that a lawful result will come about if you follow the steps correctly. That's why people feel sometimes that New Thoughters will blame the victim, so to speak. If somebody's sick and they're not getting better, you know, sometimes they're told they're not doing it right, you know, whatever it is. Now, that does go on. I don't think it goes on as much as critics suppose, but it does go on, and we have to come to terms with that. I think that ours is not a science. Ours is not a science. It's a philosophy of life. It's a philosophy of mind. It's a search. It's a search. And it is practical, and it is resultful, but here again comes the need to live with paradox, because again, we're on our knees peeking through a keyhole, and what we see is very precious, and what we see is very important. And I'm very grateful that the keyhole is there at all for us to peek through, but we catch that much perspective, that much perspective. These methods do work, and these methods do help, and these methods are impactful, but I don't think that we can fancy ourselves chefs in a kitchen who are going to get the exact same souffle every time we put in the ingredients. That's not going to happen, because there's too much else going on. There's mystery, there's paradox. The unknown is so vast, and our generation, which has been granted a glimpse of it, has only that, a glimpse.
Yeah, I really appreciated your call later in the book where you talk about elevating intellectual culture within New Thought.
Yes.
One of the things that you stress throughout the Miracle Club is, on the one hand, you have your manifestation work, you have your positive visualizations, but there's also effort, there's also preparation, there's also,
Yes.
in my own life experience, I go back to, you know, when I was an undergrad and I wanted to take the LSAT. I was busy with my classes and I thought, well, easy enough. I'll just meditate, I'll just affirm, and the answers will download. And I bombed. I did get a second crack at it. I did much better. But
I must say, I applaud you for trying that, because that experiment was valuable. Most people wouldn't try that.
Not the answer I wanted.
Yeah, wasn't what we wanted, but it was. Now you know, okay, that fails, but that's precious information.
No, that's very true. So it seems that in New Thought culture, skills, expertise tend to be undervalued. Is that something you would agree with?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think people, and this is true throughout the alternative and the New Age spiritual culture in general. And as you know, I don't use New Age in a negative way. I apply it to myself. It means therapeutic spirituality. I think that sometimes people use New Thought or the New Age culture as a kind of escape ramp, an off ramp from the demands of outer life. And they think, well, there's a different scale of values here, and I won't have to show up places on time or keep my word or help my friend Mike move. You know, that instinct and intuition and going with the flow are what's valued in this world. I don't have to abide by the time clock rules of the outer world. And I think that's a tremendous mistake, and it degrades the culture, because the fact is, anybody who can't be trusted to water a houseplant can't be trusted with the ultimate questions of life. And I think, and there's allusion to this in the Gospels, you have to be able to find your way successfully in outer life before you can begin to seriously address larger questions of existence and metaphysics and the higher workings of the mind. I think it's almost like flipping an ice cream cone upside down to think that you can escape difficulties or problems or challenges in outer life by seeking to conform to this scale of values that you presume you're going to find within a metaphysical church. That church needs to be lit, it needs to be heated, a broken window needs to be repaired. If you can't do that, then you can't maintain what's going on within the church.
Which reminds me of your critique of the pep rally nature of some New Thought church services. The idea of giving yourself a kick in the cants. It's the kind of thing that Diane, my wife, used to refer to as the dog and pony show.
Yes.
It's a pretty bold critique. Have you gotten any feedback from that in terms of either arguments or positive?
I haven't. You know, I mean, I'm very glad that the church structure exists within New Thought. It's not, for me personally speaking, I'm not a congregational kind of person, but the fact that that structure is there has served as a wonderful, wonderful conduit for communication and literature and meeting spaces and all kinds of things that are very important, including a community for people who do benefit from the congregational structure. And I applaud that. But I have been in churches, and I think we've all been in metaphysical churches, where there's almost this preschool birthday party, kind of atmosphere. And I don't have an argument with that per se if it feeds the individual, but it doesn't help us come to a theology that I think meets people at every point of life, including suffering, including end of life. And we need a theology of suffering, because in the absence of that, New Thought is not going to be able to deal with the complexities of life today. We have end-of-life issues that our forebears didn't have. People would get a terminal disease and they'd be here one day and then not here the next. But we have end-of-life issues where somebody might be living with a reduced quality of life for many, many years. And New Thought has to be able to speak to that person and say, it's true, you've been granted half a loaf, but eating half a loaf with dignity and nobility and gratitude and standing erect as you're eating half a loaf contains so much, and there's so much in the way of possibility there, even if it remains half a loaf.
And you also talk about the need to raise the intellectual culture in New Thought before New Thought sets out to address social justice issues. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
I would say that our forebears were so deeply involved in the world and in concrete methods at social betterment. Wallace D. Wattles ran for office on the Socialist Party ticket, both for position of mayor in Indiana and for Congress. Elizabeth Towne, the great publisher and New Thought writer, philosopher, was the first female alderman in the town of Holyoke, Massachusetts. She and her husband were very active in the Progressive Party, which produced the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Marcus Garvey, the pioneering Black nationalist. Father Divine, who really drew very deeply on New Thought ideas and formed, in a way, a precursor to the civil rights movement. These people were deeply engaged in the world, and I'm very encouraged by that aspect of our history. And I just think that we as individuals within the New Thought world mustn't flee from life, mustn't think that getting too distracted with current events is going to be a drag on our capacity to positively create. It could be quite the opposite. Outrage itself can direct thought and intention in ways that can be very powerful. It falls to the individual. I don't necessarily have a prescription for congregations or communities to issue position papers or statements or become involved congregationally in current events, although some may want to, some may want to. That's going to be up to ministers and their communities. But I do think that individuals within New Thought should gain a deeper awareness of how deeply engaged some of our most prominent forebears were in political and social questions of the day. I think that's a place the individual has to go. I don't have a formula for community involvement per se.
And lastly, what would you like people to know about the Miracle Club that we haven't discussed this evening? Or
anybody can join it. You're already in it. The name, the Miracle Club, is my tribute to a group of occult explorers who were active in New York City, where I live, where I'm speaking from, in the year 1875. They were a group of people that got together at an occult salon on the west side of Manhattan, and they experimented with seances and mediumship and channeling and the powers of the mind. And they didn't stay together very long, but the nucleus of that group later formed the much larger and vastly influential group, the Theosophical Society, which is responsible in many ways for the whole revolution in alternative spirituality that has swept the globe. It all began with this little group called the Miracle Club, and I wanted to recapture that spirit of informality and experimentation and hopefulness, that there really was something out there that we could discover with our minds that was possessed by that little group. And so I decided this would be a good year, 2018, for no reason of the calendar, to revive the Miracle Club. And everybody listening is automatically a member. And if they send me an email, just for fun, I'll send them a little membership card that was designed by our mutual friend, Tim Bota, great artist, great portraitist. And it's just for fun. But I was telling somebody, there was no official membership roles in the Miracle Club. You didn't need a decoder ring or anything. And then I thought, why not a decoder ring? And then I realized, well, maybe I could ask Tim to design a little membership card. He and I collaborated on that. I'll send that to anybody who wants to email me. You can find my email just by throwing my name, Mitch Horowitz, into Google. It'll take you to my website, which links directly to my email.
Okay, so if you're people that want to follow up, MitchHorowitz.com. You can also see Mitch's articles on harvbishop.com, and if you drop his name into the search field on Medium, he's got a number of outstanding articles there on a whole array of occult and New Thought issues.
And thank you, Harv, because your blog was a very important point of gestation and a jumping off point for me in writing this book. There are a number of chapters in the book that had harvbishop.com as their starting point. So your collegiality, your partnership, your friendship, and the creation of that blog as a place for those of us who are thinking through these issues to get together and exchange ideas has been absolutely seminal for me. So a deep thanks to you.
Well, deep thanks to you as well. Diane and I, as I've expressed on Facebook and in our communications, have had our relationship to New Thought. It was kind of damaged for a variety of circumstances, not necessarily going to now, but with your book, we really feel revitalized and renewed. So
I'm touched by that. Thank you. Thank you.
That book has come back to us in a big way. So good to talk to you, Mitch.
Likewise.
Many blessings.
All right. Be in touch. Bye.
Bye-bye.